Alright, here we go with the third and final segment for Monday the 11th, and hopefully we'll make it through the Spanish-American War. We left off with Teddy Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the American forces at the top of San Juan Hill, but at the end of that day, believing they were very close to a military disaster because they had taken so many casualties as they took San Juan Hill. American commanders at that point were considering withdrawing and maybe getting back on the boats with the disease spreading dramatically. But they didn't realize that everything was even worse for the Spanish, and that's something that's pretty typical in warfare. This particular war, most people think it was over quickly and that the Americans easily won everything, but this is a great example of the fact that even in warfare, as well as just about any other human endeavor, there's usually a lot more to it than people think. So the Americans were actually considering giving up, in a sense, when on July 3rd, the remaining Spanish fleet, which wasn't much, but it had left Spain at the onset of the declaration of war, and as a side note, at that point when those messages or that information got back to the United States, the New York newspapers no longer joked about what would happen if the Spanish actually did try to invade. They were much more concerned about it, not knowing where the Spanish fleet would show up. Well, it showed up on July 3rd and really attempted what in essence was a suicide run by attempting to knock the American forces away from Santiago. The American blockade had surrounded the entire island, and on July 3rd the Spanish fleet showed up, and in an attempt to take some pressure off their military forces, they made, in essence, a suicide run and were destroyed by the American Navy. So at this point, what we have is Spanish troops in Cuba, some in Puerto Rico, some in the Philippines, but they have no way of moving around. Their Navy has basically been destroyed. And interestingly, very quickly, the Spanish authorities in Cuba made it known to the American forces that they would surrender if there was one provision that the Americans would provide for them, and that was that they would provide a ride home for the Spanish troops from Cuba, because obviously the Americans had sunk theirs. And very quickly the Americans agreed, and Cuba was taken. As you see here, Roosevelt becomes the face of the victory of the United States in Cuba and ultimately the Spanish-American War. And again, as we talked about in a previous segment, this had a lot to do with the fact that he was from New York, and the New York newspapers definitely focused on him because he was sort of homeboy done good. He also was very good at drawing attention. You can see in these pictures he actually sort of dressed the part and tried to cultivate the media, and this is something that helps to explain his very rapid rise to becoming president of the United States. The U.S. then moves forward to take Puerto Rico, which surrenders quickly and with the same provision, give us a ride home. And the other thing that happens is that McKinley will then attack the Philippines. Now, when the U.S. takes Puerto Rico and ultimately attacks the Philippines, McKinley will say this is a deserved reward for freeing Cuba. So the United States doesn't take Cuba, although with the Platt Amendment, which was an amendment that was part of the agreement with the Cuban rebels who took over the island, that the U.S. could hold on to a military base there, which you know today is Guantanamo, which is where terrorists from the Iraq and Afghanistan war and found around the globe have been kept by the United States. And also an agreement with the Cubans that the U.S. could intervene in Cuba whenever necessary. That the U.S. gives Cuba its freedom, it becomes an independent nation, but then goes ahead and, as we'll see, takes what's left of the Spanish Empire for themselves. Again, as McKinley says, a deserved reward for freeing Cuba. American troops are now going to show up in Manila in the Philippines. They leave from San Francisco on June 30th, and as they head there, they are getting involved in something that had been going on almost as long as a rebellion in Cuba against the Spaniards, and that was a rebellion by Filipino nationalists against the Spanish that had not gotten as much publicity as the situation in Cuba. This rebellion was led by a man who you see there on the right, Emilio Aguinaldo, and had been supported by the United States. Not troops, but supplies, money, etc. had been brought by the Americans to help Aguinaldo. And as the Americans approached and more information came to the Philippines about what had happened in Cuba, Aguinaldo and his forces, the Filipino rebels, were very hopeful that the Americans were going to come in and give them the same deal that the Cubans had gotten. Instead, what happens is a very interesting phenomenon. At the time that the American troops arrived, the Spaniards were in the city of Manila, and they were being attacked by the forces of the Filipino guerrillas from outside the city. The Americans land behind the Filipino lines, in other words, further away from Manila, and they make a deal with Aguinaldo that says, we want to get out of here quickly, so if you'll let us go through your lines and attack the Spaniards, then the Spaniards will hopefully give up pretty quickly. And then, of course, Aguinaldo implied from that then the Americans would give the Philippines to he and his guerrilla forces. Which did occur, actually, not that they gave the Philippines to the guerrillas, but that the Americans went through the Filipino lines and actually had pretended to attack the Spaniards, because one of the things that Aguinaldo did not know was that prior to landing, the Americans had sent officials to speak with the Spanish, who were pretty much in the same scenario or situation that their comrades in both Cuba and in Puerto Rico were dealing with, and that was that they had no ride home, no way of being supplied, and so they had actually made a secret agreement with the Americans beforehand that said that when the Americans pretended to attack Manila, that the Spanish would actually give up. So the Spaniards gave up for the same provision, a ride back home to Spain, and so the U.S. then took over Manila. Now, it was at this point that the phrase you see here that McKinley spoke is very important. It was at this point that McKinley made it plain that the United States was not going to give up the Philippines or give it its independence, and his argument was they are too primitive to have the capacity for self-government. Now, this was obviously a racist statement, in fact, not even a very intelligent one, but it was based on the racism of the United States, but also the imperialistic goals that the U.S. had, and so it was something that caused Aguinaldo and his forces to become very angry. Aguinaldo stated, we have not fought this war to exchange one colonial master for another. And then what happens is the beginning of something that ends up costing the United States many more lives than the Spanish-American War did, and also a lot more money and effort than the Spanish-American War did, and that's called the Filipino insurrection or the Filipino rebellion. Aguinaldo's rebels then actually attacked the American forces in Manila as they find out that the U.S. would not give them their independence. The U.S. forces hold on to Manila and ultimately drive the rebels into the mountains. Now, the general that was leading the American forces at the time was General Arthur MacArthur, whose son Douglas MacArthur, of course, will play a big role in World War II in the Philippines. MacArthur said there's no organized force remaining, but as you can see here, the Filipinos had not given up. They just changed their tactics to guerrilla warfare. They began terrorism and assassination of U.S. officials and any Filipinos that worked with the American forces. They used hit-and-run guerrilla attacks, booby traps, ambushes, and hoped to wear out their American invaders as they saw them. And here's a description of the remains of one attack on American forces by the guerrillas that American forces found afterwards. An American observer of the remains of one massacre wrote this: Captain Connell's head was slow roasting in a fire. His body, naked and mutilated, was found crammed into the garrison latrine. A knife slash across the face of Lieutenant Bumpus had been filled with strawberry jam. One of the Americans had his abdomen slashed open, and someone had dumped a sack of flour in the cavity. The hatred of the Americans by the guerrillas was pretty severe, and of course the American forces returned that attitude. And as a result of this, the U.S. government will sanction all kinds of actions to try and stop the rebellion, including the one we'll see here on the next slide, which is something they called back then the water cure. Now, if you take a look at this ought to look somewhat familiar to you, because this is something that currently is called waterboarding. And so the idea of using this method of extracting information is nothing new. They'll hold somebody down, hold their hand over their nose that their mouth has to open so that they may breathe, and force them to drink in water until they either gasp out the information that the person wants, or their internal organs will actually explode from having too much liquid in them. So this is the water cure, or we call it, as we call it today, waterboarding. The U.S. government will sanction that, as well as any other effort that can be used to destroy the guerrillas. They'll add more troops trying to stop the rebellion. Upwards of 70,000 American troops are in the Philippines by the end of 1900. Many Americans had a phrase that they followed when they were there, the notion that they were going there to civilize the natives, who were supposedly not civilized, and it was to civilize them with a Krag. The Krag Jorgensen was the rifle that was the standard issue to the U.S. military. MacArthur then said success depends upon isolating the guerrillas from their support, and so he began to create camps to protect villagers from being terrorized into supporting Aguinaldo, forcing farmers into camps, and then begins missions to scour the countryside for guerrillas. And I have there, of course, sound familiar, because this is exactly what Weyler had done back in Cuba, and what MacArthur was doing was actually forming strategic hamlets and beginning the search and destroy program that we'll be talking about, of course, when we look at Vietnam. Now, this actually works in the Philippines. Aguinaldo and his forces are stopped in 1902, although there are sporadic difficulties from then on. The basic rebellion is ended as Aguinaldo is captured. But this same method of attempting to stop a guerrilla insurgency is not successful against Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. And in order to kind of set that up and also kind of put closure on the Filipino rebellion, we're going to do now a little comparison between the two. In the Philippines in 1898 to 1902, one of the differences is that the Philippines are islands, and so if you run the program that we're talking about here, that Weyler had tried and that the Americans will use here and then attempt to try in Vietnam, if you run it correctly, forcing everyone into camps and then search and destroy missions, if you do it right, then the enemy guerrillas are either killed by the search and destroy missions, or they're pushed into the ocean because they have no sanctuary. In Vietnam, the situation was very different. As you can see here, South Vietnam is where the American troops stayed, and they actually set up different places throughout South Vietnam as strategic hamlets. The problem they had was, when they did this, the enemy guerrillas could actually go into these neutral countries of Cambodia and Laos that the United States military was technically told to stay out of, which we did for the most part, and use those as sanctuaries. So one big difference: the guerrillas in Vietnam had a sanctuary. The next one, outside assistance. Aguinaldo was unable to get any major power to help him from outside, because if you can get outside assistance, the fact that you don't produce your own weapons or have a specific base of operations is not going to hurt you quite as much. But Aguinaldo actually knew who to go to and actually try to get support. In 1901, he actually went to Japan and asked them if they wanted to assist him in his attempt to make life miserable for the Americans. And he'd gone to the right place, obviously, but the Japanese were not yet ready to take on the United States. I usually joke that they said that they would wait until December 7th, 1941 to do that, but they turned him down. It wasn't that Aguinaldo didn't understand what he needed, but instead he was unable to get it. The North Vietnamese, however, get massive amounts of support from the other communist nations of China and Russia, helping them to the tune of $500 billion in today's currency. Now, the final big difference: the Filipino rebellion, a much shorter period of time, very little media coverage because it was so far away from the major media areas, while the Vietnam War lasts over 10 years, and of course it's the first TV war, causing mass dissension in the United States. So you can see the difference between the two. It will lead to the Treaty of Paris in 1899. Initially, there's a negative reaction amongst a lot of Americans to the treaty because the Filipino problem is at the forefront at that point. Although a majority of Americans approved of the treaty, ratification by 2/3 of the Senate was far from certain, and we'll talk about that when we begin class on Wednesday.